That was disgusting. That was not even a game. That was a open practice for Kirby Smart and company. That was just a complete, utter embarrassment for TCU. Hence the kazoo noise at the beginning of the video. Georgia 65, TCU 7. The only national title game that was more unbalanced than this in recent memory was when Alabama and Notre Dame took the field in 2012. And even that final score was closer. The difference was it took Notre Dame several quarters to score, whereas TCU, it looked, and it was an illusion, but it looked like they maybe had some life in them early when they went on a 5-play, 75-yard drive that took 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Georgia's the undisputed number 1 team in the country. That's my takeaway. No one, not Michigan, not Ohio State, not Alabama, not Tennessee, no one was beating this team or winning more than 4 games in a 10-game series, except maybe Ohio State, but that's due to matchups, not due to the overall quality of team. The overall quality of team that Georgia is unmatched this year. Now, I don't know if this Georgia team is better than last year's Georgia team, but on offense, they certainly are. They certainly played better when it mattered most compared to last year's team. This Georgia team in the national title game made no mistakes whatsoever. Unlike last year's national title game versus Alabama, where they did make several mistakes. And part of it was because they played a superior team to this TCU team, which another takeaway would be that I think this TCU team was the ultimate Cinderella story. And it fooled me, and it fooled everyone. But there was a reason that 13.5-point spread existed. And that was because TCU deserved to be there. But, like, simulations and computers say, TCU had a very small chance of getting here to begin with for a reason. Because TCU, truth be told, by football power, by potential power, by analytics, by talent, all those things factored in, is probably not a top 4 team. Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama would probably beat them more often than not in a 10-game series, and I'd argue the same thing for Tennessee and maybe Penn State. I think that TCU, they have a great coaching staff, they're ridiculously efficient with their talent, but the problem is with that talent and lack thereof compared to a team like Georgia comes consequences. They used the mulligan, they played their hearts out against Michigan, and they just couldn't recover in time for the behemoth that was Georgia. Let me read you all some statistics here. Georgia, 589 total yards to TCU's 188. Georgia, no turnovers. TCU 3. Georgia, 32 first downs. TCU 9. Georgia, 36 minutes and 59 seconds of TOP. TCU 23-0-1. Georgia, 4 penalties for 30 yards. TCU 5 penalties for 50 yards. TCU 1.3 yards per rush. Georgia 5.8. TCU 6.6 yards per pass. Georgia 12.0 yards per pass. TCU 2 of 11 on third down. Georgia 9 of 13. TCU 0 of 2 on fourth down. Georgia 1 of 1. And then finally, one of the more impressive stats, Georgia 1 punt for 48 yards. TCU 5 punts for 185 yards. And Georgia did not punt all game until the third quarter. This is impressive. And it's a beatdown. I watched this game, the whole thing, intensively, looking at every play until about the fourth quarter, when by then it's over. Georgia's putting in Carson Beck. Stetson Bennett's played his last snap. What a legend. What a legend he is. Finishes the season with 27 passing touchdowns and 7 picks, a 161.2 passer rating, an 87.8 QBR. He's won 2 national titles after the struggles that he had in 2020. He put it together in 2021, and in 2022, I think he had his best season as a Bulldog, despite the fact that statistically he was superior last year. He passed for nearly 1,300 more yards. He completed 4% more of his passes, and he scored a total of 7 more touchdowns compared to last season. He was a bigger part of this Georgia offense. He was given more responsibility, delegated more responsibility compared to last year's Georgia team. And unlike last year's Georgia team, where he threw the SEC title away, and where he made a turnover in the national title game, here he made no turnovers in the national title game. He had a 200 passer rating, a 226.9 passer rating, and a 99.5 QBR, and he won the SEC, and he went 15-0. He led Georgia to their best season by record and by number of achievements, not by potential power, but by actual, visible, non-theoretical results. He led Georgia to its best season in school history. What a quarterback. And whether he is going to be, a starter in the NFL or a backup, I definitely believe he has an NFL future. His football IQ is too good. His balls that he throws are always accurate. He has an arm. He is so incredibly fast on the ground. He simply ran around D. Winters like it was nothing. It's TCU's star linebacker. Just what an awesome game by Georgia. And I'm not going to be talking too much about TCU because, let's be honest, there isn't much to talk about when you lose by 58 points. There's not a whole lot to talk about. I mean, I and most of the world thought it was unlikely that Georgia was going to cover that 13.5 point spread. Nope. Georgia alone covered the over-under. They scored 65 points. The over-under was 61.5. I digress. That game was disgusting. TCU had diarrhea in the diaper. Like complete, bloody, graphic diarrhea. It was horrible. It was horrible, and that's contrasted to Georgia playing their best game of the year. TCU plays one of their worst games, probably their worst game of the year. There's in no universe where TCU wins this game. Actually, there is, but it's maybe like 1 in 1,000 that TCU pulls this off. And it would probably be by a field goal or a very late touchdown. I mean, Georgia assassinated them. They straight up killed them. They beheaded them on live TV. TCU looked worn out and dead on all sides of the ball. Nothing was going right. Duggan, he had several overthrows. Georgia's secondary got a few turnovers and picks, and at the same time you watch the game, there were wide open guys. Quentin Johnson could have had another, big reception down the field, but Duggan overthrew it, and it fell right into the hands of a Georgia defensive back who wasn't covering Johnson well, but Duggan misread it, and it fell right into the Georgia defensive back's hands. I mean, honestly, the execution by the players, it wasn't just on the coaching staff for TCU. The execution of TCU's entire game plan was disgusting. It was like the moment was too big for them, but it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that the moment was too big for them mentally. It was that Georgia was too big for them physically. Georgia was just too good. They were too fast. Georgia didn't overlook TCU. They took TCU seriously, and you could see that in how they didn't take out their starters until the fourth or late third quarter. They didn't mind running up the score. They took TCU seriously. They took winning a national title seriously. and that's why they're here. It's the stark difference between this game and the Fiesta Bowl for TCU. It's also the stark difference between Georgia and Michigan. Michigan was a little distracted. They looked a little ahead. Michigan got a little arrogant and complacent, and they were looking ahead to Ohio State and Georgia. And Georgia is also faster than Michigan is. They're more resilient than Michigan is. And that's why they did to TCU what I thought Michigan was going to do to TCU. I mean, I thought Michigan was going to blow out TCU. And that it would take a few quarters because Michigan's a second half team, as the Fiesta Bowl showed, but that they would blow out the Horned Frogs. And that's what Georgia did. Because Georgia prepped well. I mean, Georgia, they didn't even have the month that Michigan had to prepare for TCU, but because of their superior coaching staff, talent, I mean, Stetson Bennett, as far as I'm concerned, after this game is the better quarterback than Max Duggan is. I mean, this game, to me, showed that, Duggan went from, in my opinion, being the quarterback who should have won the Heisman to now he should have been fourth. Stroud, Bennett, Caleb Williams are all so much better statistically. And, Caleb Williams has a similar supporting cast to Duggan. Not good defense, but great offense. Similar with Stroud. Bennett has the ultimate, supporting cast, but he has the highest level of achievement, and he has the most consistent track record in big games. So, I don't know what to tell you. If you're a TCU fan, I know what to tell you if you're a Georgia fan. You're the new number one program in the country. I'd still, just by resume, say that Nick Saban's the best head coach, but Kirby Smart's certainly the second best head coach in the country, considering all-time, resume. And I would say that, if you're looking at from a recency bias angle instead of a past decade bias, I would say that he is the top coach in the country. You're the top program, you have the best staff in the country, and you have a top 2 head coach in the country, and you have a top 2 talent roster in the country. And you will be a playoff team next year. You've earned that benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that Jalen Carter will be gone, Stetson Bennett will be gone, Kenny McIntosh will be gone, other players will be gone. Bowers probably isn't Bowers eligible for the draft? I'm pretty sure he is, or Darnell Washington too. They'll lose a lot of guys, but then they'll reload. They've earned that number one place. For TCU, it's very simple. Well, it's actually not very simple. It's very complicated. Because if TCU went 12-2 and Michigan blew them out in the Fiesta Bowl, it would be simple. They weren't a playoff team from the beginning. They never even they didn't even deserve to be in the playoff. If this was the semifinal game, that would be the narrative. But they beat Michigan. They won 12 regular season games. They had the number one strength of record for the longest time. They finished number 2 in the polls and number 2 in strength of record despite that blowout loss to Georgia. Many analytics websites have them well outside the top 6, and that's where this discussion is. This TCU team is resilient. They're mentally tough. They are, they're the team, they're honestly, they're what Michigan State was last year in 2021. Mix of incoming transfers, mix of current talent assembled, under the radar, and they filled themselves to the brim. They used everything they had. They achieved the best result possible for their season, is what TCU did. You did the best you could. And what happens when you do the best you can do, and you're still far inferior to the best team in the country, and you take advantage of Michigan not exactly preparing for you and being their own worst enemy. Ohio State loses to Georgia. The committee still lets you in after losing your conference championship game. This happens. This is like Michigan State in 2015 going to the playoff and Alabama destroys them. Or they get destroyed by Bama in the Capital One Bowl after 2010. This is like Michigan, Michigan playing Georgia last year, even though Michigan, same with Michigan State in 15, by resume, they deserve to be in the playoff. But in reality, they were on a completely different level than the teams they faced in the semifinal game. You get these lopsided results. That's sort of the trade-off with being in the playoff instead of, it's only a top 2 BCS game, and if you're, 3 or 4, you get to play in a bowl game against an opponent who's likely inferior to who you were going to play in the college football playoff. There's more risk, and there's more reward. If TCU in the BCS system, they probably would have went on to win their bowl game and finish 13-1, and there'd be more momentum heading into next year. Less hurt, because losing 65-7 hurts. But they won the Fiesta Bowl. There's a lot to be proud of. And they just were not even close to Georgia. They played like a D, F, maybe C at best level of game, and Georgia played their A+ game. And that's what it is. I mean, after this game, I find it very hard to argue unless you like to factor in, unless you really prioritize achievement. Like, if achievement is the only way to rank teams, and if you believe that, then you believe in invitationals where winning your conference deserves you to get into the playoff, which is where you and I would disagree with. The only way you could rank TCU in the top 4 after that blowout would be by believing in an invitational system. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but a top 4 team doesn't lose to Georgia by 50. Ohio State lost by 1, and there's no universe in which Ohio State loses to Georgia by 50. There's no universes to which Michigan loses to Georgia by 50, or Alabama, or heck, even Tennessee, or Penn State. There's no universe in which those teams lose to Georgia by 50. None. And if it is, it's just like the universe in which TCU beats Georgia. 1 out of 1,000. 1 out of 1,000. So the Cinderella story expired. It does not take away from what TCU achieved this season. I mean, this is the most, I would say, by talent, like looking at talent, this is the most impressive and most overachieving. This is the most overachieving college football playoff team in history. Like, in the college football playoff era, this is the most overachieving team. They were projected to go 4-8 or 5-7, and you win a playoff game. Michigan State, they haven't won a playoff game. Let's see who else. Oklahoma, who's in your own conference and who has infinitely more talent than you do, haven't won a playoff game. Notre Dame hasn't won a playoff game. TCU won a playoff game. Cincinnati didn't win a playoff game, and they were, preseason top 15. They had less talent than TCU, but by expectations, they were expected to do a lot more than this TCU team. This TCU team, what they did is ridiculously impressive. No one can take away from that. It's just like what Georgia did, in a certain sense of like high achievement. Both of these teams should get A+ grades at the end of the season. And that's where, honestly, that's where the talent and the staff and the, potential power and the analytics come in, is both of these teams should get A+ grades on their season report cards. They did the best that they could. The difference was TCU's best just isn't anywhere close to Georgia's best. There's different tiers in college football. Completely different tiers. TCU did something that Michigan and Ohio State didn't do. Michigan and Ohio State didn't live up to their full potential. They don't get A+ on their report cards. They don't. Michigan overachieved their expectations, but they could have beaten TCU. Maybe they couldn't have beaten Georgia, but they could have beaten TCU. They failed there. Ohio State. Ohio State is a field goal missed away from probably being 13-1. And since they hosted Michigan, and since they played, a better playoff game than Michigan did, there's an argument that, hey, Ohio State could be up here. They could be 15-0 or 14-1. TCU and Georgia are unique in the sense that they did the best that they could in the season. And maybe you could put Washington and some of these other teams up there, like Tulane, for example, did extremely well for preseason expectations and for the talent on deck. But Georgia's just a different animal. Kirby Smart, again, is the nation's best head coach, and he has the nation's best coaching staff. Todd Monken, let me tell you something. Getting Brock Bowers repeatedly open, him training Stetson Bennett to, have patience, stay in the pocket, or scramble outside if you need some space and breathing room and just wait for routes to develop. Stetson Bennett is a completely different player than he was in 2020. And he's a better player than he was in 2021. And the thing about Georgia's offense is, as shown by some of their plays in the national title game, as shown by, for example, Adonai Mitchell's 22-yard pass from Stetson Bennett, as showed from, Ladd McConkey's 14-yard pass in the third quarter, as shown by Stetson Bennett's 21-yard run. Georgia doesn't even need busted plays to score over and over again. They don't. Georgia, from a 50-50 perspective, like if you're talking about TCU perfectly covering Georgia and Georgia being stubborn and they're throwing 50-50 balls and they're not scheming guys wide open, Georgia still wins. You have Brock Bowers, you have Darnell Washington. I mean, you can't cover them. It's so hard to cover them, and TCU didn't, they failed to cover them. But Todd Monken, whether it's seam routes, whether it's those wheel routes in motion, whether it's Stetson Bennett's run, and just utilizing that, whether it was on the QB power, I think is what it was, to the left, which TCU completely unguarded. They scheme guys wide open. And they make Stetson Bennett's life and they make Georgia's offense's life 100 times easier. And they make Joe Gillespie's job miserable. That's TCU's defensive coordinator. And then Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp shutting down a top 10 offense and holding them to 7 points, 3 turnovers. It really is insanity. Let me read you some of these statistics from Georgia's receivers and players outside of Stetson Bennett, whom we already covered. Carson Beck went 2 of 3 for 31 yards as well. He did get some playing time. Kenny McIntosh, 8 carries for 50 yards. Branson Robinson, 7 carries for 42 yards and 2 touchdowns. Stetson Bennett, 3 carries for 39 yards and 2 touchdowns. Sevon Clark, 5 carries for 35 yards, no touchdowns. See, I haven't even heard of him before. He's only had 7 rushing attempts for 44 yards on the season. He deep in the backup area. Kendall Milton, 10 carries, 33 yards, and a touchdown. Dejon Edwards, 5 carries, 30 yards, no touchdowns. Brock Bowers, 2 carries for 15 yards. Ladd McConkey, a carry for 15 yards. Georgia had 254 rushing yards for 5.8 yards per carry. On the receiving end of things, Georgia receivers averaged 16.8 yards per reception. Brock Bowers had 7 receptions for 152 yards and 1 touchdown. He averaged 21.7 yards per reception. Ladd McConkey had 5 receptions for 88 yards. He averaged 17.6 yards per reception, and he had 2 receiving touchdowns. McConkey had 762 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns on the year. Brock Bowers, on the other hand, 942 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns. He averaged 15 flat yards per reception. This season, he also had 9 rushing attempts for 109 yards, and he had 3 rushing touchdowns. So, Georgia's playmakers, you also got to remember Adonai Mitchell, Darnell Washington, Kyrus Jackson, they each had 1 reception for 20 yards or more. They have players. I mean, their receivers played perfect. They made multiple big plays. They beat down a TCU secondary who I thought, outside of Michigan's, was the best secondary in the playoff. And believe me, Georgia's might be the second best. I still think Michigan's is the best. The difference is their front 7 is not anywhere near what Georgia's front 7 is. Let's be real. But listen, they cooked TCU's secondary. Straight up cooked them. Burned them. You know, on defense, Trevius Hodges-Tomlinson looked like a fool the entire game, and he's extremely good. D. Winters looked like a fool. I mean, their defense really, really struggled. Completely struggled against Georgia's offense. They held them to a field goal, but their offense couldn't score. That was the more critical thing for TCU, is their offense was helpless, because you watched the Michigan game and you knew that Georgia would score at minimum high 30s, probably in the 40s against TCU. You knew that was coming. The question was whether TCU's offense could do anything. Well, what could they do? Could they score 20, 30, 40, 50? I thought they could score in the 40s. Kind of repeat what they did with the Michigan game. But no, they did not. They did not. They didn't. Georgia shut them down perfectly, and TCU, much like Michigan was against TCU, TCU at times was their own worst enemy. Duggan throwing into coverage, overthrowing and underthrowing his receivers, Duggan reading a play terribly wrong when he should have handed it off, instead took it for a 6-yard loss early in the first quarter on what was supposed to be a read option. The Cinderella story died painfully, in painful fashion, as they looked lifeless the whole game. Sonny Dykes will have a lot to build off of in the coming years despite this game, though. I want to say that winning a playoff game is big for recruiting. It's going to be big for job security. And if he can maintain this staff next year, we'll see what happens. By the way, TCU's defense after this game fell to 91st in the country in scoring defense. They allowed 29 points per game on defense. 91st in the country in scoring defense. They are an offensive powerhouse, and if you can limit their offense, you will beat them. Which is why, as a Michigan fan, to harken back to that game, I more so blamed Jesse Minter and the Michigan defense than I did J.J. McCarthy and the offense, though there was a lot to blame there. The Horned Frogs' failure, I think this is very important. It'll be used to support the coming 12-team playoff. Because I heard some people say that, TCU, what if they played an extra game? If they play an extra game, because that widens the margin of error, and in theory, playing extra games means you're going to more likely shake out who's bad and who's good. Kind of like March Madness in a certain sense, where you have multiple rounds and Cinderella stories die before they reach the national title. And yeah, this will be used. Like, hey, 4-team playoff, TCU, they got lucky in one game. That'll be the narrative. They got lucky in one game, and there is some truth to that, but that'll still be the narrative. They got lucky in one game, and then Georgia cooked them. In an 8 or 12-team playoff where there's an extra game, maybe 2 extra games, TCU doesn't make it past the first round even, or the second, or the third. They don't reach to the national title. And this game and this result will be used for that. Much like the 2012 Alabama-Notre Dame was used to support a 12-team playoff where pundits they wanted Alabama to face Florida or Oregon along with Notre Dame, go through another round of competition. This game will be used for that. And I don't think it will be an adequate solution to, solving a dominant team like Georgia winning it, because it's very hard to upset these teams unless you're also an elite team like aka Ohio State. But what it can do, to the credit of those who will use that to advocate for an expanded playoff, is root out teams like TCU and keep national title games more competitive. But at the same time, 2018, 19, 20, 21, though 21 was very competitive until the fourth quarter, most of the recent national title games have not been competitive for more than a half. They just haven't. It's been very clear by middle of the third quarter in the past half decade of national titles, except for last year's, who was going to win the game. So who knows if an expanded playoff will solve disparities like this. That's not for me to decide. That's actually for the games and the teams who participate in those to decide. That's all I'm going to say for this video. Georgia's the best team in the country, hands down, and next year they'll certainly be a top 4 team. That's for sure. I'm already going to start doing preseason talk after I release 2 or 3 videos talking about the postseason, specifically grading Big Ten teams' success and naming my all Big Ten team. But a preseason top 25 for 2023 is going to come real soon. Same with some predictions for the 2023 season. So hit the notification bell to stay tuned for that. Hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell once again, like this video, and comment your thoughts on last night's murder down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.